for all those who made it here on time. Why don't we begin? We're going to start with a few introductions. And so first, I want to welcome everyone. I'm Rabbi Landsberg, the rabbi here at Temple Emanu-El. Hello, Emanu-El Nicks. Hello, Arts at Canada Nicks. Hello, everyone else who's found their way to this program this morning. It really is a pleasure, and clearly this has touched it touched a nerve. There are a lot of people who wanted to join us today for this learning in particular. And so it is my pleasure. I'm about to turn over to the head of Arts Canada, to Lee Weiser. Let me simply say beforehand, Lee, if you give me just one moment, my little aspect of the tech is I am about to disable your ability to unmute. I will turn over to Josh. We'll change that when it's time for questions, but this way it just makes for an easier flow. And as well, I'm about to change the settings so that your chat will go, where did it? Hang on. So that your chat goes to hosts and co-hosts, actually. One thing we find in large groups and large conversations, side conversations or chat-only conversations don't serve our larger conversation. So we're forwarding any kind of chat into the hosts and co-hosts, and we will be monitoring that. And let me now, there you go. I've disabled the mute, but we are still so glad you're here. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rabbi Landsberg. And I am a proud member of Temple Emanu-El, and also very honored to be the current president of Arts of Canada. And I want to thank Temple Emanu-El for sponsoring and hosting this webinar series and for bringing us together at this time. In a world where polarization and black and white thinking seem to dominate, it's important that we're open to learning and discovery. And that is why we are so grateful to Josh Scharf for sharing his knowledge with us and for giving us a framework to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Josh is an American Israeli Jewish educator. He is currently pursuing rabbinical ordination at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And at the same time, he is completing his master's degree in Jewish history at the Hebrew University. Josh also works as the Development, Resource, and External Relations Coordinator at Beit Daniel Synagogue, the Reform Synagogue in Tel Aviv. He's also a song leader and a guitar player and an avid baseball fan. Josh has a bachelor's degree in history from Yale University and grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. Josh, thank you for being with us and for leading us in understanding the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Over to you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all for being here. This is a really, it's a huge kavod. It's a huge honor for me to be here and to see all of you who have taken time out of your weekend hours, your Sunday morning, to come and join a discussion about these issues. It's really touching for me as now an Israeli for the past 6+ years, that there are so many people who want to engage in these discussions, even when Israel perhaps is not in the day-to-day headlines. And so I just want to, again, thank you, both Lee and Rabbi, for having me, for all of you for being here with me this morning. It's great to be here. Lee sort of shared it all about me. As you can hear, I'm from, a little bit south of Toronto, from the Midwest of the United States. I've been here in the Middle East for the last, for most of my adult life. One of the ways that I've always connected to the world around me is through history, particularly our history, and particularly last year's the history of the land of Israel. I'm going to share some of that with you, but really quickly, a couple logistics. As Rabbi mentioned, we're going to keep the chat between you all and the administrators on the call right now. But what I would like to invite everyone to do at some point during this session is to put in the chat a question that in a discussion about the conflict you would like to be touched on. We have 3 more sessions after this one, and I would greatly appreciate if you would take the moment to formulate a question that I can then, as I look forward, I can tweak my lesson, my ideas and my outlines, so I can better touch on the things that interest you. So please, if you would, put those in the chat. No pressure to do it now. You can do it throughout the session. And questions for as we go through, I'll do my best to stop every few minutes, open the floor to questions, see if there's anything that needs clarifying, and then move forward from there. A little quick intro about what we're going to do here in the next 4 weeks. These sessions are going to dive into the history of the conflict. How are we going to do this? We're going to go, for the most part, chronologically. We're going to move from sort of what most historians of this area consider to be sort of the beginning of the modern state of Israel as we know it today. And we'll move forward in time. Obviously, we're not going to touch on everything, but what I'll try to do is find pivotal moments, but also to pull out themes that are going to keep coming back over and over again here. So when we can start asking ourselves sort of the big questions of what's going on. And I'll every time I get to one, I'll be sure to say, this is a theme that we're going to see over and over again. Because my goal is to give context for what's happening today. And in order to do that, we need to go a good ways back in history. Another goal of mine is to give space to different narratives here, to tell the story as best we can, to have different voices and different narratives in our minds. And also to help, I'm sure we all come to this conflict and this discussion from different places. And I want to give, my goal is to give people a little bit more comfort and not say, my goal is to not have you walking away from this feeling, that you'll have the right answer to something that you see online, or you'll be able to say, well, I don't know about this op-ed here or there, but to just have some more background, a little bit more comfort to say, okay, I feel like I can now move in to this subject matters. A couple disclaimers before I do that. The first is, I tell this story from a particular point of view. I am a Jew, I am an Israeli. I believe in our absolute right as a people to the nation state in our homeland, in the land of Israel. And there are a lot of people who would take this narrative and tell it very differently. So just keep that in mind. As much as I will try to put a lot of voices and ideas forward, it's important to keep that in mind. And I just encourage you all to continue to educate yourselves past our short time together in these next couple of weeks. The other disclaimer is that I'm hoping that for each and every one of you sitting here, I can tell you, even myself today in the past days as I've been doing my research, I've challenged myself. I've found ideas and read different thinkers about different events, and I haven't liked everything I've read. It's made me uncomfortable. And so my hope is to push people past their comfort zone a little bit in the next 4 weeks. And I know we all come from different perspectives and ideologies, but I hope that something I say over the next few weeks challenges you in your understanding of these events. And the last thing is just a request that I ask of everyone that I work with when it comes to education around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the state of Israel, at all the Middle East, is I just ask that you do your best for this short time that we're together to take those North American goggles that we wear and that we view the world through, and take them off and put them to the side for a while. Just recognizing that we're talking about history that didn't happen in the context of the history that maybe we learned in elementary school or high school or in college. That this is a different history, a different context, different players on the world scene really shaped what happened here. So I invite you to do that, to take your preconceived notions to the side. And with that in mind, we're just going to jump right in. So I've tried to organize my thoughts today. What I'm going to try to do is bring us from the 1880s up until the 1948, the establishment of the state of Israel. I can't promise you I'm going to get through all of that today, but I'm going to do my darndest. I don't know if it was said earlier, but if we leak a little bit past the 60 minutes of the course, that's fine. I have some time blocked out, so but we'll see how we're doing as we go. The first thing that I want to do is I'm going to start with chapter 1, and let's put a little context into what we're talking about. Our story starts in the 1880s. So what's going on in the world of 1880? Lee, can you give me a thumbs up that the share screen is working? Yeah, great, wonderful. So I've called this course The Conflict History in Today. And what I want to do very quickly is give a look into Europe in the 1880s, because this is where our story begins. Very quickly, just for some context. We're talking about imperial Europe, right? These large empires are the dominant geopolitical forces in the world. The German Empire is the young ascending power on the scene. France and the United Kingdom are established colonial powers globally. And most Jews, the Jewish story that we're talking about right now, most Jews are located in an area that's called the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, which is a topic for another time. A lot of things that come up today are topics for classes, unto themselves. But the Jewish story is really happening in here in Eastern Europe. Of course, there are Jews in Western Europe that are going through religious reform. That's where the reform and conservative movements are born in this 19th century. The 19th century is an amazing century for European Jewry. For the first time, Jews are welcomed in as citizens to many of these countries. And the promise of emancipation, of the ability to be a citizen in your home country, is one that will move Jews to react in numerous ways to this. And also the non-fulfillment of that promise will be a huge motivator for what happens next. In Palestine, the land of Israel, we're talking about a small sort of secondary region that belongs to the Ottoman Empire. Thank you, Rabbi.
And just your screen share did stop.
Yes, that was purposeful, but thank you for letting me know that those bars are in the way. I'll make sure to move them for next time. Palestine, or the land of Israel, as I said, is a secondary province of the Ottoman Empire. The living situation is based around the small cities, right? Some of them that you might have been to or know of today, Tzfat and Hebron, Jerusalem being, of course, a spiritual center, but still, in the terms of this vast Ottoman Empire, a really small piece, and one that the Ottomans didn't see as part and parcel or exceptionally important to their imperial project. The majority of the population here, there's, according to the Ottoman census from the time, there's something between 400,000 and 500,000 people, most of them located in these small cities. A majority are Arab Muslim, and the setup of the society is that the Turks are the administrative and governmental head. The Arab Muslim, they're organized around family and clan that have political power within the cities. And then you have the largest part of society, which are the laborers, either day laborers as merchants, but in particular, agricultural workers. And so this is the situation of the world in 1880. Right before our story kicks into high gear. The year 1881 is an exceptionally important year in Jewish history. I'm hopeful that things are not being blocked this time. Nope.
Yeah, they are, Josh. If you just move the window, move those away. There you go, and or even just close them. And the other one, on the right side of your presentation, it's blocking our ability to see it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to move. Okay, is that out of the way?
There's still one at the bottom.
So Josh, you can actually, I think it's probably watching all of us if you just shrink it.
There we go. Okay, great. So 1881, on the left, you see the gentleman here is Tsar Alexander II, who was assassinated in 1881 by a group of anti-government radicals, one of whom is a Jewish woman, comes from Jewish origins. But this does not stop an onslaught of anti-Jewish violence, a wave of pogroms that become known in Jewish parlance as Sufot B'Negev, the storms of the South. And the vigor and the rage that rips through these Jewish communities, especially in Tsarist Russia, over the next 3 years, kicks off a massive wave of Jewish immigration throughout the world. As you can see, this map, this isn't the final numbers. This gets us to about 1900, 1905, but the vast majority of immigration goes to North America, both the United States and Canada. There's a large number that goes to Western Europe, but there's another group. For the first time in the 1880s, we see organic Jewish organization around this idea of physically taking yourself out of where you are, out of diaspora, and moving yourself to Eretz Yisrael, right, the land of Israel. And that's where our Jewish story really begins. So that was chapter 1. I just wanted to try to put things into context for everyone. And in 1881 and the 1880s, we begin, and this is where chapter 2 of our story today starts, where we're talking about Jewish settlement in the land of Israel up until about World War I. I want to tell you who these people were and how they, the society that they began to build, because this will begin to, I don't want to, it's not the cause, but from this sort of these beginnings, we'll start to see the tension bubbling to the surface in the decades to come. So when we speak about immigration to the land of Israel, and I know we're gonna there's a lot of vocabulary here, so I'll try to make sure that if I think that we'll have a new word for people here, I want to make sure that it's put in its proper context. We talk about Aliyah, right? We talk about you go to take an Aliyah to the Torah, Aliyah to Israel, but in historical terms, we can say that an Aliyah is also a wave of immigration. So we're talking about Aliyot, and the Israeli historians break it down into 5 waves of immigration. Of course, these are historical terms that we put on after the fact to be able to differentiate between different groups of people and different motivations for why they arrived in Israel. But the first Aliyah, we're talking about a time period from about 1882 to 1903. So over the course of these 2 decades, we're talking about a group of mainly poorer, very traditional Jews and their families that moved to the land of Israel to make it their home. Within this group of people, they know they're going to the Holy Land. They're going, home, but we don't yet see this organized national ethos or plan for state building that we'll see later and in later aliyot. The overwhelming majority of these individuals are from Tsarist Russia. They're either Yiddish or Russian speaking. And we'll come back to that as an important point later. But all of them are fleeing from, as I mentioned before, that there had been a promise made throughout the 19th century to Europe's Jews that if you become citizens of this country, if you meet us somewhere in the middle, right, you'll have all the rights and all the opportunities that any other, ethnic Russian or ethnic Ukrainian would have in the Russian Empire. And that's simply not the case. It didn't happen. And so the sort of breaking of that promise, together with the growing threat of violence, pushes these people away, but they also running towards, right? You talk of push and pull factors when it comes to immigration. They're running towards the promise of self realization and both self-realization and national realization. And this Aliyah is very agrarian in its roots. You see a photo here of Jewish immigrants coming into the Jaffa port in the last decades of the 19th century. You see here a group of gentlemen still very much dressed in their European best, but out on the Israeli frontier. And so we see this clash of the identity that the Jews bring with them from Europe and the identity that they're going to will be a necessity to create anew once they arrive in the land of Israel. You see here another group of Jewish immigrants to the land of Israel. And here you see the building of, I believe it's Rosh Pinah, which is a city in the north of Israel, again near Tzfat, as sort of as one of the first cities built during this first wave of Aliyah. And these are really modest undertakings. It's all funded by European Jewish money, the Rothschild family, the de Hirsch family. And so what the goal of this first Aliyah is, and we're making this very short because there's a lot to get through, was that they wanted to achieve financial independence in the land of Israel. They wanted to set up communities, and they wanted to build in a way that they would be able to be independent, right? To finance themselves, to live a life of dignity, as all human beings do. The economy that they built in the first cities, maybe you've heard Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, both now in the Tel Aviv area. But these are cities that their economy is totally based on, in this case, the citrus harvest in the land of Israel. Up north, there are small settlements called moshavot that are these little farming settlements, and the Jewish economy that's created over this 20-year period is completely and utterly tied up with European money that's being brought in and the Ottoman reality that these Jews move into. And the inability for these first immigrants to sort of shake off the European influence and the outside sources of help to build their vision for something better later will really affect this next Aliyah that we'll get to just now. And that is the second Aliyah. Will take us back to our presentation here. Pardon me. The second Aliyah spans the course of a decade from 1904 to 1914. In many ways, very, very similar to the first wave of immigrants. It's also the reason that we picked 1904 is that just as in 1881, there was a major wave of pogroms. In 1903, there's a pogrom in the city of Kishinev, which is now in Moldova, what's today is Moldova. And it's one of the most violent pogroms on record to that point. And it captures, first of all, it's the first pogrom that's published in global newspapers, non-Jewish sources. But it also captures the Jewish popular imagination after a poem called In the City of Slaughter by Chaim Nachman Bialik, who will become the sort of the poet laureate of the Jewish people of the day. And of course, the pogrom is not the only reason why Jews continue to leave. But this is a group of Jews that many of them grew up under incredibly repressive laws that were brought in after the assassination of Alexander II in the 1880s. And they're also heavily affected by the intellectual goings on in the Russian intelligentsia of the time. Radicalism, socialism, anti-governmental forces, and they bring this force with them. And you know, the historians 10%, 12%, 8%, but there's a strong group of these young people that moved to the land of Israel during this decade. By the way, many names you may recognize, names like David Ben Gurion makes Aliyah to Israel during this time period. Eliezer ben Yehuda, the man who's credited with reviving in many ways the modern Hebrew language, moves to Israel during this time. So this is a real push forward for the Zionist idea that is becoming more and more popular with world Jewry, particularly in Europe at this time, but spreading around. As I mentioned, that this is, you know, these visionaries who are coming to build the state. Again, just some visuals from this Aliyah to sort of give you a nostalgic feeling. You know, you see Jews out in the fields. These are the things that Jews were not allowed to do in the Russian Empire. We weren't allowed to take part in agriculture according to the laws of Tsarist Russia. And so a big part of what we see here is to reintegrate ourselves with the land, to meet the land anew. You hear in the second Aliyah a lot of watchwords, but one of them is livnot ulihibanot, to build and to be built, to build the land of Israel, but have the land of Israel rebuild us anew. Again, agricultural work, you can see, as opposed to those first pictures where the men kept their very European style, we're starting to see, keffiyeh, right? This very Arab headdress come into the dress of young Jewish men as they meet their new surroundings and they try to make themselves part of their new surroundings. Obviously, the kibbutz will become a huge part of the collective memory of the second Aliyah. You see here, this is a group of kibbutz. The Hebrew, unfortunately, is too blurry for me to read. This is a group of young men and women who came together already in Europe with the intentionality to move to Israel and start a kibbutz. 1909 is a very pivotal year here. Two important events happen that sort of shape the destiny of what Israel is today. The first, on the left side, is a photo of the founding of Tel Aviv. This happens in 1909. While people love to call it the first Hebrew city, there's a great argument to be made that Hebrew was alive and spoken elsewhere in other Jewish cities before then. But Tel Aviv is founded by Olim, immigrants from the second Aliyah, who the dreams of what they want to build are reflected in Tel Aviv, a very European city, a boulevard, an architecture that mixes both Mediterranean with European, education as one of its central goals. And on the right, we have the first kibbutz, Kvutzat Degania. Degania is right next to the Sea of Galilee, up north. This is the first kibbutz that's founded, and these both happen in 1909. And both of these really shape who these Jews are and who they can become in their new home. And they shape this new identity through building both the metropolis, the city of Tel Aviv, but also this experiment in collective living, this kibbutz, which is something that is utterly unique unto Israeli and to Jewish history in modern parlance. And I encourage you to seek out information about it. It's an amazing subject in this history that we don't have enough time to go into now. And we're coming up to a stopping point here in a moment. We'll ask for questions, but I just want to emphasize here that the second Aliyah it's not only about building, it's not only about what's happening on the ground, it's also about creating a renewed mentality, a mentality that they'll call Hayudiya Chadash, the new Jew, to take everything that was European, to take the diaspora and shake it off, right? To create a new identity for this Jew coming home. And I mentioned that one of the watchwords, there are a few watchwords of the second Aliyah, but one of the mottos of the second Aliyah is Avodah Ivrit, Safa Ivrit, Shmira Ivrit, which translates to Hebrew labor, Hebrew language, and Hebrew guard. And the point behind this is that Hebrew here, meaning literally the Hebrew people, right? Who's going to do the labor on the land of Israel? The Hebrews. What language are we going to speak? We're going to speak the Hebrew language. And who's going to keep us safe? The Hebrews, right? We're going to protect ourselves. And keep in mind the idea of Hebrew labor and Hebrew guard, because I'm going to come back to it in a moment after questions, when we talk about the relationship between Jews and Arabs living in the land at the time. And there's one last thing I want to mention before I stop here. And I just want to show you quickly a map that shows you, pardon my scrolling here, that shows you the course of building in Israel between the first and second Aliyah, 1882 to 1914, right? We set up until World War I. And you can see that there's not a whole lot of organized, there's not a collective plan of building. This is because the land ownership was completely Turkish, right? The Turks owned this land, and the Jews looking to purchase it would take whatever would come their way, whatever Turk was looking to make a return on his investment, could come along and sell to Jewish brokers, who would then, of course, give the land over to Jews living in the land of Israel. But as you can see here, nothing has come together as an overarching plan. And one of the big differences between sort of the Jewish national project before World War I and after World War I is that after World War I, we're going to see very intentional, strategic community building to set facts on the ground. But before World War I, we don't really have this yet. We see this sort of growth in the area around Tel Aviv. We see around the Sea of Galilee, many agricultural communities, kibbutzim, moshavot, and also non-communist kibbutz, which is a moshav. Thank you. I was going to get to that word eventually. And so I just wanted to give everyone an idea of what this building looked like. So I've thrown a lot out there in these first few minutes. And so I just want to take a quick breath and turn it over and see if there's any clarifications I can give, because we're going to really dive into the crux of the matter in a minute or two here. So Rabbi, I'll turn that to you.
Okay, lovely. Friends, you are welcome to raise your hand if you'd like in the Zoom room, and we'll do that, or write your question in the chat, and we're happy to take either way. I saw Leslie ask the question she put in the chat. What citizenship and residency status did these migrants have?
That's an excellent question. So the Arabs living in Ottoman Palestine would have been, many of them, Ottoman citizens. Not all, though. Most of them, it would have been quite a bureaucratic process. And so if you didn't have business to do elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, you wouldn't really need to hold on to citizenship. The Jews who migrated here did not hold Ottoman citizenship. Very, very few got Ottoman citizenship, especially as the years go by, because one thing I didn't mention is that the Ottoman Empire already in the 1880s is known as the sick man of Europe. Everyone knows that the Ottoman Empire is weakening. It is past its prime. And so Jews moving, especially in that first decade of the 20th century, the second Aliyah specifically, didn't take Ottoman citizenship because A, they would need to give up their citizenship from home, and B, there was the Ottoman passport, it ain't what it used to was, to use an American phrase. And so that's a short answer to a great question.
Beautiful. So I don't see any other questions at this point. I do want to remind everyone, Josh, you're covering a lot of background to make sure that we can move forward to today with solid grounding. This will be, a recording of this will be hosted on the Emanu-El website, on Artsa website. So if there's material that you want to review, you will have that opportunity. I do believe actually one other question just came in, actually, which is, what was the local reaction to the Aliyot?
Yeah, that's a great question. That gets me already into chapter 3, which is the relationship between the Jews and the Arabs in these very early years. As just mentioned, everyone is subject to the Ottoman Turks. Remember, up until World War I, the Ottoman Turks are on top. And the Ottomans had very little interest in any sort of ethnic tension bubbling up underneath the surface of their control. Because what does an empire want at the end of the day? Obviously to enrich themselves, but order. Empires and power hates chaos. They want order. And so the introduction of a vast amount of Jewish immigrants all at once would have caused some disorder. The problem that the Ottomans were facing was, again, their power is waning. And Europe had taken a new, especially the United Kingdom, the Protestant countries had taken a renewed interest in the Holy Land, looking to prove the authenticity of the Bible. Biblical archaeology has a big heyday during the last decades of the 19th century. And so these European countries demanded that the borders be open, more or less, and which worked for the betterment that worked to help the Jewish cause. I don't think purposefully, I don't think it's what the Ottomans intended to do, but this policy certainly did. Again, the 80s, 90s, and the first decade of the 20th century, the land outside of the cities where there's Arab land ownership, and some outside, but the vast, vast majority of the land that we call the land of Israel, Palestine, as it would have been known in the Ottoman Empire, would have belonged to Turks, and only through purchasing the land from the Turks would Jews be able to start building communities. Rabbi, are you looking to pop in?
Two more questions that just came up. And then how about after these two, then just flow right to your next chapter, and we'll hold the rest of the questions. So the last two questions that came in are, did these first two immigration waves result in displacement of locals, and what was the legality? And was there any early conflict between religious Jews and the secular Jews from the kibbutzim?
I'll answer the second question first. The answer is yes. I don't have a great deal of source information to give you today about that, but I'll jot it down, and ideally I'll be able to come up with something for next time we meet. I think no, I don't want to throw anything out there without reading a little bit more on that. So if you'll, with your permission, I'll hold off on trying to gauge an answer there. But the first question of displacement, the way the economy worked outside of the cities, again, is that the Arab landowners held, the Ottoman Turk landowners had land upon which lived Arab agricultural laborers. The word in Arabic is falahin, this sort of class of agricultural workers. And they, through the grace of their Ottoman landlords, lived in the land, worked the land, gained sustenance from the land. But it's not as though the Ottoman landlords had any sort of great love for these people. It was a landlord, it was a renter-rentee relationship. So when Jews came in and purchased the land legally, that of course infringed on the land that these Arab families and clans and tribes had maybe worked for decades, had maybe worked for centuries under the same land-owning Turkish family. And so certainly that put pressure, and it moved. We start to see in these early decades, but really speeding up towards World War I, a move from the countryside, as it were, into the cities of the Arab population, because that's where work moves, right? As less agricultural land is cut out for, or more agricultural land is sold away, there's a migration into the cities, which will definitely have effect on events later. Another cultural, we also start to see these cultural differences really start to have both sides butting heads, not in any sort of organized way, but really on a local level, where one of the customs especially if there were, remember, we're not just talking about ethnic Arab Muslims, we're talking about Bedouins, right? Which are, they share similarities, but these are two separate groups of individuals. And one of the customs locally here was that if you lived on land that someone else had a claim to, you would pay them protection money, right? Now you might say, well, that, it sounds like, in our context, it sounds like The Godfather. But remember, we're talking about a different cultural context where we're talking about a really dangerous area, right? Animals, bandits. It's a sort of a Wild West, what we're talking about. And in order to protect yourself, you outsource your protection. And so the Jews found themselves many times outsourcing their protection to the local Arab families and tribes. Eventually, right, which inevitably would lead to conflict, right? One side would not like the way the other was doing things, whether someone was late on their payment or whether someone didn't show up quite quickly enough when times were dire. It came to, it could lead to small incidents, right? We're not talking about anything organized yet, right? It's just in its infancy. But again, you're starting to see these cultural differences as the root of a struggle that will become much bigger. We see the first Jewish self-defense organizations in 1907 with Bar Giora, 1909 HaShomer. And so we start to see, again, this ethos of the second Aliyah, again, the Avodah Ivrit, Safa Ivrit, and the Shmira Ivrit, to take on more of these jobs for ourselves. One of the other things that happens is that on the big citrus orchards of Petah Tikva, of the coastal area, a lot of them would hire Arab laborers. But this idea of Avodah Ivrit, right, this idea of giving of Hebrew labor, it's really the spirit of the kibbutzim in this agricultural collectivist movement that pushes people forward to hire Jews to work their land, right? To stop outsourcing the labor to Arabs. Now, in the mind of the Jews, this was, of course, a necessity, right? This is, of course, we are building towards something greater. And in order to do that, we need to be self-sustainable. We need to build something that is ours, right? That outside forces will obviously affect, but we can sustain ourselves. But the Arab experience of that same mindset, right, where it's hiring Jews, there's no job, it pushes them out of the economy, which of course, when people face changing or dire economic circumstances, right, there's always course, worry and blame to be put around. And so these cultural differences and this sort of slow move of a growing Jewish, what will eventually become a self-sustaining economy, plays a big role. All right. That was a very quick chapter 3. Rabbi, are there any burning questions to speak of at the moment, or can I move forward into World War I?
Move forward, please. Great.
Great. Okay, so the quickest World War I lesson you'll ever experience in your life, because our time is short and precious. The experience for the Jews of the land of Israel during World War I is a difficult one. Distrusted by the Turks, many of them expelled and jailed. Critically, many Jews who live in the land of Israel are expelled, but then they join the Allied powers, specifically the British Army, and will receive some military training, what's called the Jewish Legion, which then they'll bring back to the land of Israel for the events after World War I. Moving back into a visual here. Sorry, but just to give everyone an idea of what post World War I Middle East looked like. The Ottoman Empire is no more. It has collapsed, and the Middle East is carved up primarily between new sovereign states, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and then the French and the British also come in and carve up the Middle East with mandates granted to them by the new League of Nations. And this is a critical importance for the Jews of the land of Israel, because near the end of the war in 1917, on the right side, a very famous declaration is offered by the British government called the Balfour Declaration, in which the government sets forth its official policy of looking on with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and a commitment to work towards that effect. To us, maybe it seems quaint in our post-colonial mind that a global power would come and say, well, this can happen here. But at the time, friends, we're talking about a time in the world where 1 out of every 4 human beings was was part of the British Empire. This was a big deal that the British Empire said to the Jewish people, we will work towards the implementation of your national project. So much so that even one of the local papers here in the land of Israel changed their dates. They started dating again from 0, from the Balfour Declaration. They saw it as such incredible importance this occurrence. What does it mean to have a mandate, right? What does it mean, a British mandate in Palestine? Very quickly, the British take on for themselves, right? They've just won World War I. They're taking more colonial control, and they take on themselves this unenviable task of a mandate, which says that we're going to prepare the local population for independence when the time comes. What they find is, over the next 2 decades of their mandate, is that there are 2 peoples in this one land, both sides with legitimate claims to a home and willing to fight for it. So the British will find themselves both in the crosshairs of Jewish-Arab tensions that rise, but also fighting against both Jewish and Arab forces independently of one another. What we're going to see is that in the decades after World War I, as I just mentioned, these really small pieces of conflict that started before will begin to bubble over. So I'm going to dive right into that, and then stop for questions at the end of this next section. So chapter 4, we're going to call Developments in the Land of Israel After World War I. And there's 3 sort of developments that I want to present to you right now for thought. First of all, in the wake of World War I, the British come in, and because the British are pro-Jewish national home, Jewish settlement and Jewish immigration continues and increases. All right. After World War I, there are 3 more Aliyot, pre-state immigration waves. 1919, 1923 is the 3rd Aliyah. You see the 4th Aliyah and the 5th Aliyah, and each one only gains in the number of immigrants, right? In the first wave of Aliyah, it depends on who you ask, but something like 25,000 to 30,000 Jews immigrate to the land of Israel with only about a retention rate of maybe 50%. The conditions were not great here to support life. It was an incredibly hard situation, and the retention rate was quite low. But each of these aliyot, as there's more of as the infrastructure improves, as there are more communities in which to live, more ways of life in which to live, the cosmopolitan Tel Aviv and the small cities that develop around it, or the agrarian and rural kibbutzim and moshavim, will continue Jewish settlement and building. The other important, the largest wave, of course, is more than 250,000 people that happens between 1929 and 1939, and we'll come back to that. And I just want to show you a difference in the mindset of the pre-World War I aliyot and the post-World War I aliyot, is that while of course there were cities and communities built before World War I, we can see here with just a short list of different institutions that were built in the 20s and 30s, where you can see that a state is really taking shape, right? You have your universities, the Technion, which is the technical university, the Hebrew University, which Bezrat Hashem, I'll be graduating from in the next few months. The Workers' Union, the Histadrut, Habima, the National Theater, the Jewish Agency, giving a quasi-governmental agency to the Jews of the land of Israel, the port, the oil refinery, the electric company. All of these things being built, right, with it's clear that there's planning ahead, right? They're building towards something, and that's a big difference for the Jews of the land of Israel post-World War I. And we see that Jewish nationalism has really matured, has really come to its own. Zionism is an idea that has grown and splintered into factions and is spreading throughout the Jewish world. In the 20s, we see American Zionism come of its own. My apologies, I will need to go back and find out the early origins of Canadian Zionism, and hopefully come with a little bit more information about that next week. But we see Jewish nationalism is fully matured. So that's one, this Jewish settlement continuing. The second part of chapter 4 is Arab nationalism. Now, it's too tough to tackle in its entirety, but basically, in the vacuum that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire leaves, there's room for dreaming and imagination about what a new Middle East will look like. And one of the ways that void is filled, right? The Zionists obviously have one view of this, but Arab nationalism is born, and one idea in particular takes great hold in the Arab world, and this is called Pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism, in one sentence, is the belief in Arab unity throughout the Middle East that will work towards building great Arabic-speaking either nations or sort of a larger Arabic-speaking empire. This is a very popular idea up until sort of the end of the 1970s into the 80s. And one of its early adopters is a name that's going to come up a few more times today, and so I want to mention it now. This gentleman here, his name is Hajj Muhammad Amin al-Husseini. The Hajj is an honorific for a Muslim that has gone on the Hajj to Mecca. And al-Husseini comes from one of the great Jerusalem clans, one of the most powerful Arab families. He serves as a soldier in the Ottoman army, in the artillery in World War I. And then in the wake of the war, he's exposed to Pan-Arabism and is really brought to it. And the only way to realize Pan-Arabism is to get rid of the foreign influence in the Middle East, which of course, in the view of a Pan-Arabist from the time, is both the British, the French, and also the Jews, right? Seen as a foreign body, a foreign power coming in to take away this future, this imagined future of what the Middle East can be. And he will be an incredibly powerful force in Palestinian, or excuse me, I made the mistake of using that term, in local Arab leadership in the decades up until the foundation of the state. And so I wanted to mention his name here. So Arab nationalism really rears its head during World War I and right after. And so now we have two competing national visions, right? We have a Jewish national vision, we have an Arab national vision. And while perhaps the Jewish national vision has come into its own a little bit before, the Arab national vision is coming right behind and offering a different idea of what the Middle East could be. That's two. Three is that in the 1920s, we start to see the first incidents of violence between Arabs and Jews that are named. And it's sort of an odd way to categorize these. Why does it matter if they're named or not? If you give an event a name, it means it has significance. And it means we remember it by that name. And so the two that I want to mention here are, the first is Tel Chai, which is in the very northernmost part of the state of Israel today. And it's a battle that it takes place, you see right here, very, very tip top of what is Israel today. This is the memorial at the site of the battle. And this is a battle between Jewish militia forces and local Arab militia forces. And it depends on who you ask. Is this just is this a spillover from the French and English fighting between the mandates in the Middle East, or is this the first instance where Arab-Jewish violence takes place? I'll leave that to your historical thinking to make a decision. This event happens in March of 1920, where the Arab forces come to the Jewish settlement of Tel Chai and say, we're going to come and search for French spies. The Jewish forces do not allow them to enter. Fighting breaks out. Jews are killed. Arabs are killed. And of course, the press, the Jewish press and the Arab press, run with it. Run with this story that happens far away from sort of the heart of what's taking place in the country. But it speeds up a growing narrative and a growing clashing point between these two national visions. Okay. The second event are the Nebi Musa riots, which happened the next month. This is a procession that happens on Easter in Jerusalem. Musa is the Arabic name of Moses. So this is a commemoration of Moses, who was also a prophet in Islam. And around these events, around the walls, you can see here the city of Jerusalem, the old city walls in the very background on the top right. Around these events where there are speeches given, very nationalistic in their nature, calling for the ouster of the British and calling for the ouster of the Jews. Husseini is one of the speakers at this event. And it's in a protest of the Balfour Declaration of saying, who are you to come in and say that this is what the future will be? British forces are called in to maintain order, but fighting breaks out. And these two events, one right on the back of the other, bring up a couple of very interesting changes of mind for really both sides, the Arab and Jewish side of this conflict. The first is that this is going to be a violent conflict, right? That was never assured, right? Nothing is ever, in my reading of history, nothing is ever set in stone. But the realization that this is going to demand violence to fulfill our ends. And the second, that both sides come to the understanding, and they make the decision that the British are not here to protect us; they're looking out for the other side. And so it's up to us to work to thwart the British. Okay, stop here for a couple of questions. Rabbi, with your permission, I think we'll already say we're going to go past a couple minutes today, just because I really want to get us to a rational stopping point so we can dive into events next week. But I want to stop here and see if there's anything to clear up at this point.
Okay, so there were two questions that had come in while you were speaking, and then I'll turn over again. Friends, feel free to either raise your hand or just put your question into the chat. So better understand the dynamic between the pre-World War I legal transfer sale of Turkish land to, quote, new Jews, constantly hearing about the land being taken from Arabs, even though this is before the creation of the nation. Seems like you may have contextualized that, but if there's more that you'd want to add. And what was the Christian population at this time, and whose side were they on?
That's a great question. They are by the first decade of the 20th century, and I'll go back, but I believe already by that first decade of the 20th century, the Christians are the third largest religious group in the land of Israel. The Jewish immigration surpasses. There's always been a Christian population here, but it's always been much smaller than the Muslim population. And I would need to do more reading into that. It's an excellent question. My gut feeling is that the ties of Arab brotherhood and this idea of a future where there's a united Arabic-speaking majority Arab ethnic states, something in the Middle East would have attracted them. That said, their religious connection to the British, obviously a Christian nation, I imagine also helped bridge some tensions there. But by the time that violence will break out in earnest in the late 1930s, the ethnic lines are really tightly drawn. We're Jewish ethnic on one side and Arab ethnic on one side across religious lines.
Thank you. Okay. I think those were the questions that were raised. So
Great.
back to you.
Perfect. I know I'm throwing a lot at you, and I certainly, the lucky thing that we have here is that there's no tests. And I'm actually going to jump ahead here just with respect of time, because there's a couple more just a few more things that are absolutely central that I want to present to us today, so that we can really jump into the state of Israel, what happens when we become an independent nation state in the late 1940s. The first is the most significant event of this conflict that I imagine that most of you have never heard of. In the 1920s and 30s, we have Jewish development, the continued growth and sort of the entrenchment of national sentiments on both sides. There's more violence, which unfortunately, well, in this context, we're not going to be able to cover just because of respective time. That by the end of the 1930s, first of all, we see for the first time an organized local Arab leadership in the form of the Arab Higher Committee, which is a group that's it's the British give them their blessing. And the family that takes control of this committee is the Al-Husseini clan. And this will put them in a particular political position. There are other families that if they had taken leadership, there would have been a very different political approach to both the British and the Jews. But history played out the way that it did. And also through the 1930s, the number of Jewish immigrants continues to grow. 1936 marking a high point of 1 year, 60,000 new Jewish immigrants arrived to the land of Israel. Both Jewish and Arab militias have developed on the ground. The Jewish, you might be familiar with, we'll call them paramilitary organizations. The Haganah is one whose name you might be familiar with. A breakoff group called the Irgun or the Etzel breaks off in the early 1930s in a fight over the approach to the British. And on the Arab side, there's an organization called the Black Hand that is actively working to acts of sabotage. All these paramilitary groups are working to sabotage the British and to push back the forces on the other side that are trying to hold the national dream of the other down. And finally, in 1936, a lot of these forces come together, and an event plays out that's called in history called the Arab Revolt. And this event takes place between 1936 and 1939, 3 straight years of increased. It starts as a general strike, right? The call goes out to the Arab workers of Mandate Palestine to throw down your shovels and your picks and your axes. Strike, go in the streets, close your shops. We will not cooperate in this economy with the British and the Jews because they're not working to our best interest. A general strike is called, and at the beginning of the general strike holds. It's a mostly peaceful demonstration. Pardon me as I jump ahead a bit. As I said, we just need to get on to our next topic here, the Arab Revolt. As you can see here, photos of a strike, right? Men who would normally be in their occupations went out to the street. You can see here, if you recognize this street in Jaffa right here, and you can see that there's just general strikes across the street, a complete labor shortage, which cripples the local economy. For a while, that status quo holds. Several months into the Arab Revolt, things turn violent. Some of the riots, some of the strikes turn into riots, and then the British forces on the ground respond with great force against the Arab street. There are estimates of up to 10% of the Arab male population is killed during these 3 years. Many are incarcerated and executed after being tried in British courts. Injuries, weapons are confiscated. The Arab economy over these 3 years, the Arab society is absolutely shaken by these events. On the other side, the Jewish economy, the Jewish society thrives. While the British are using one hand with incredible force to keep down what they see as a threat from Arab society, the Jewish society says there are incidents of violence between Arabs and Jews, but for the most part, the Jews stay out of it. The yishuv, the organized Jewish community, stays out, and that allows the economy to prosper. It allows for the paramilitary organizations, the Haganah, to become even more organized. They get trained by the British Army. And so this event over 3 years, I really can't stress enough that Arab society is absolutely ripped apart by this 3-year span. We can see here a British convoy that had been struck by a local Arab militia that would have been taking supplies, and that would have been stopped. On the right side, we can see local Arabs who have been arrested by British forces and are now being held, incarcerated by the British for anti-British activities. And so we rush into World War II in a historical lens in 1939, with one side incredibly empowered by these last 3 years, and the other side, the Jewish society and economy is thriving, whereas the Arab society and economy is devastated by these events. And this sets us up for the fight for independence, which will happen in the wake of World War II, with one side really ready and prepared to go into battle as that reality becomes inevitable, and the other side really struggling to find leadership. That Al-Husseini is just one name. The local Arab leadership is sent into exile by the British. And so this Arab Revolt is an incredibly central piece and an event that's not really discussed when it comes to this history, in my understanding, that really sets the stage for independence. I'm going to end in 60 seconds and leave whatever time left for clarification and for sort of a look forward to next week. You might have noticed that we haven't established a Jewish state yet, and I'm going to do that in about 90 seconds. And we'll revisit this right at the beginning of next week's class because there's some important information here. The British, in the wake, even before World War II, as part of the Arab Revolt, start thinking maybe this mandate thing in this area is not our best idea. They really get fed up with it, right? There are casualties. There's a lot of questioning about why should we hold on to this. And for the first time in the late 1930s, the idea is presented of partition. Perhaps we'll take this very contested piece of land and we'll split it. We'll make a Jewish state and we'll make an Arab state. And this is the compromise that will push us forward into some sort of coexistence in the Middle East. This theme, this idea of two states, will keep coming back throughout our weeks together. So keep that in mind. The other theme here is that the League of Nations gives the British the mandate. The British will then pass along the responsibility for the mandate to the United Nations to make a final decisions about Israel, or what becomes Israel, right? Mandate Palestine. And another theme that we'll see is the involvement of international powers. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, the USSR, the Arab and other Muslim countries. What is their role going to be in this ongoing conflict as we move forward in time? So we'll keep that in mind as well. World War II is devastating globally, but what it does is it sets the table for Jewish independence in in the land of Israel. And rather than trying to go into the details of how that happens over the next in the next 2 or 3 minutes, I'll leave that for the very beginning of next time. But just to sum up today, I'll try to put the transformations that we discussed today into a little bit of context. So we go from the land of Israel as a secondary Ottoman province to a jewel in the British colonial empire, and then eventually to a Jewish nation in 1948 in the course of really about 70 years. But as you can see, even from a short time together, so much happens here. So when we're thinking about the land, Ottoman, British to then Jewish statehood. For Jews, obviously, this is a modern miracle that takes place. For Arabs, right, the word that will be used as catastrophe is Nakba. We'll come back to this term in next week's session. We have a state that's built by primarily Jewish Olim from Europe, right? They build a modern nation state in their own image, and they rework their own identity to become a new Jew in order to build this. And I hope that I was able to bring this through the way I presented things, but the origins of this conflict are rooted in the pre-state decades, right? These early cultural differences that become aggravated, that these people have to leave their land and not understand why. These are the things that root the conflict. Yet the shape of the conflict and how we know the conflict today really comes in the wake of the War of Independence, of the events of 1947 and 48. And that's exactly where we'll pick up next week. The founding of the state, the dual refugee crisis, and we'll move into the 50s and 60s as Israel as a sovereign nation begins to grapple with its complex reality in a rapidly changing and at times less than friendly Middle East. Okay, a few minutes, questions. I know there's a lot. Thank you so much for your patience, and I'll just turn it over from the few questions that are out there. I'd be happy to answer a few.
So there were a few that came up while you were talking. One
Great.
was, who supplied the Arabs with their arms? And the other is, what borders are we talking about during this period?
Great. The overall supply of Arab armaments is a complicated one at the time. Most of the local Arab militias were armed by Arab allies in the Middle East that, of course, got their weaponry either through the British, who were trying, for example, the Hashemite family, which becomes the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Their incredibly impressive army, the Arab Legion, is totally funded, armed, equipped, and trained by the British Empire. Also the Saudis, famously Lawrence of Arabia, who develops the relationship with the what's now the Saudi royal family. And so the British have interest there. In Syria, it's French arms. And so they sort of spread into Mandate Palestine. And of course, at different times, the British are either working very closely with Jewish forces, as in during the Arab Revolt. And there are other times where the British are working even more closely with local Arab militias. And so sometimes directly from the British in Mandate Palestine, with both sides. The first question was borders. What borders are we talking about? And that's one of the things I want to open with next time, because if we get into that, that'll really, sort of blur things up. So I want to do borders and establishing a state very first thing next time. I hope that leaves people with some spoilers and a desire to come back.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So I do want to take a moment to say, David posted to everyone in the chat where the recordings will be accessible on the Emanu-El website. You'll be able to access it easily through our website. For all those who want to review the material or share the material, we're getting to how do we speak about this? And what you've shared clearly is there's a lot of comfort one needs to have an understanding of what has been. Other few points very quickly before I thank you is that should anybody who's in attendance have questions that didn't come up immediately during our time with Josh today, feel free to email them to me and I will forward them along. I will collate them and forward them along so that Josh will have the opportunity to very much think about all of them in advance and work them into answers into our session next time. We will be using the same link. Registration will remain open if there's anyone you think would want to join us who doesn't yet know about it. And with that, oh, and David just posted my email address. Thank you, David, for that. Josh, I do want to thank you. It's always fabulous and interesting when you join us here. Time to take a deep breath. There's so much that you have already shared, and we have so much more to go. And we're looking forward to seeing you again, God willing, in good health next week. So everyone who's joined us today, thank you so much. Arts of Canada for making this happen. It really is our pleasure always to be working together to connect Reform Jews across this country in learning and programming together. So I wish everybody Shavua Tov.